Okay, so welcome, or welcome back if you've watched the first two videos. We're going to look in this final video at creating a rock texture. And whereas for the ground we used a photograph, for the rock we're going to use what's called procedural texturing. And I'll explain what that means as we go. So I'm just going to click on the cube, go to materials, add a new material, and it gives us our basic material here. Okay, so to start with, I'm going to add in a reflection node. Now this reflection node is one that I've made myself. I've watched many videos on physically based rendering, mainly by Cinecat Pro, and I'll leave a link in the description to his YouTube channel. Well worth watching his series on physically based rendering. And through that I built this, which has this correct Fresnel node in it, because the Fresnel node in Blender does not work. And Fresnel is basically how light that is coming in on a steep angle, sort of reflecting just off the side there's going to be more reflectivity than the light that bounces back at 90 degrees to you from the center of something. So on a sphere you'd get more reflectivity round the edges. That basically is a rather simplistic version of what Fresnel is. So I've got this, and I can mess around with the specular. If we turn specular all the way up and roughness all the way down, we basically end up with a chrome material. If we take the roughness up, still this colour, because specular's there, still it's highly reflective of what is around it, but it's rougher. So it's still not taking really much account of this colour. So if you notice I've changed the colour to red, it's hardly changed that at all. So let's get this back to white. But if I turn specularity down, we end up with the colour coming through and the roughness. And if we turn roughness down as well, we end up with something perhaps more like a highly polished ceramic. Still reflective because it's got no roughness, but the colour's allowed to show through. Okay, so with that in mind, what we're going to do is we're going to go for a sort of greyish coloured rock, and we want it fairly rough with a little bit of specularity so that we're just catching some of the sunlight on the edges. We'll tweak that later. Okay. Now what I want actually is a mixture of this lighter grey and a darker grey. So I'm going to duplicate that. And we're actually going to use a mix shader to mix the two. Now, when we first do that, let's just drop this down to a really dark grey. It's mixing them 50-50, 50% of each, and we've just got the one colour. So if I go all the way to the left, we get the lighter one, and if we go all the way to the right, we get the one in the bottom. And we need some way to mix them. And this is what I mean by procedural texturing. So we're going to create a texture, and that's going to be the factor between the two. So we're going to use a map for that to say which bits are dark and which bits are light. So I'm going to add in a texture, and I'm going to add in a noise texture. And we'll take the colour into factor. Okay, so let's just turn this over. Now, with Node Wrangler, it's an add-on for Blender. If you Control Shift and click on any texture, you can see on any node, sorry, you can see exactly what the result of that is. Okay, so that's our noise texture. Control click again, it takes us to the other one. So actually we want the factor, not the colour in there, because that's the black and white one. Okay, and what that should be giving us is a bit of a mix of the two colours. I'm just going to make it more obvious for now by having it black and white. And we're going to turn the scale up now. Turning the scale up actually makes the pattern darker, so we can see there we've got light and dark patches on there. So this is more how many times it's repeated across the texture. So we'll go for around about 20. Okay, I'm just going to take that down a little bit now we can see it. Okay, so we've got light grey, dark grey. Okay, and that is the basic, very basic rock that we're going to use. Now, I can also use this factor in another way, and this is going to add a lot more realism. If I put this in displacement, you'll remember in the last one we used a displacement modifier. Well, because I'm using this noise texture to show the light and dark pieces, I can do the displacement here. So let's have a look what happens. So we can see now that noise texture is adding micro texture to the rock. Okay, it's a little bit strong. So to sort that out, we're going to add a math value in there, and we're going to multiply it. And of course, you multiply anything by less than 1, multiply it by half, it halves it. So it was on 1. We can see how that texture is quite pronounced. We could make it more pronounced. Multiply it by 5. That's obviously very unrealistic. I'm going to try 0.3. A little bit too subtle. 0.6. Okay, and I quite like that for now. Okay, that's giving us a lot more realism, a mix between the two. I'm going to drop the darkness down of that light colour a little bit more. And there we go. Okay, so that's the first bit done. Now what I want to do is add in, I'm just going to group some of the, well, I'm going to minimise some of these. I won't group them together for now. So what we want to do now is add some moss in. So we're going to have another reflection. When I can find it. Let's just move this up. And we're going to mix that in here with a mix shader. Now at the moment we've got nothing in there, so it's adding lots of reflectivity and specular to it that we don't want. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a moss texture to it. So again, we're going to add a texture, image texture. I'm going to open that, go into my textures, and we've got this moss colour here. So that's going to drop into a diffuse. And the colour's going to drop in like that. Okay, so we've got our image texture. And we've got it mixing with this mix shader. Now as you can see again, it's giving us like a dirty green grey all over, and that's because we haven't got anything plugged in here. We could, if we wanted, use the factor from the noise texture again, but that's already repeating what's on there, so it doesn't show really any difference, because it's the same bits that are creating the dark and light effect that are then also adding the green bits in. So we need another one. We could use another noise texture. So let's see what that looks like. So shift and add texture noise. Take the factor into there. Let's scale it up a bit. And take the detail up. I'm just going to use Node Wrangler. And I think what's happening here is it's fairly low contrast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a converter and a colour ramp. So you briefly saw me use this in the previous one, and this is basically for adjusting contrast. So what we actually want is to increase the contrast by bringing these two closer together . And then we can control shift on here, and we can now see we've got definite green and grey bits. So there's a green bit. Let's just control shift click on here to see. So the black bits are controlling the green, the white bits are controlling the grey. So we can go for either great contrast and there you can see on the rock we've got a definite separation between green and grey. Now the problem is we've got too much at the moment and it looks a little bit fake, and the reason is that moss would tend to grow in the crevices where it stays damper, and it wouldn't tend to grow in this random fashion all over the rock. So what we're going to do is actually, I'll scroll out, and we're going to get rid of this noise texture, and we're going to add in input geometry, and we're going to use something called pointiness. Now what pointiness does is, I'll just keep clicking and get down to pointiness. If you look, there's a very subtle difference on here because we haven't got sharp angles. It is very subtle. I don't know if you'll see it on here, but we'll put it through the colour ramp node in a minute. Some parts of this are lighter than others, and it's to do with the pointiness. So let's put it into the colour ramp, and now we can see it a little bit more. So I'm going to scroll into this colour ramp so that you can see what I'm doing. And we go into increase the contrast. So we can see now in this crevice just going to keep pulling it back a bit. So the edges here are white, and that's where the grey is, but we want them whiter. And we want the inside dark because at the moment the dark is taking over. So we'll click on this again. The green, the moss, sorry, is taking over. So the black represents the moss. So let's take that there. Let's bring this down. Okay. Not really enough. You can see there's more green inside these crevices and more grey on the outside, but it's not quite enough. So let's increase that contrast even more. Well, let's twist it round a bit. Okay, a little bit too much now. Let's go back to this and let's take this black down a fraction. There. That looks pretty good to me. Okay, so we've now got a rock that looks weathered. It's got moss growing on it. And it's got moss growing on it in a realistic way. So there you go. A procedurally shaded, textured rock that would look good in any scene. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part series on how to make rocks, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. Thank you and goodbye.